Soft, mysterious background music begins. The sound of wind howling through stone corridors. Rain tapping against ancient glass. A single warm light flickers in a tower window high above the dark valley below. Imagine a kingdom so beautiful, poets traveled for months just to describe it in words. A kingdom where the mountains touched the clouds, where silver rivers ran through golden fields, and where the stars seemed to hang lower in the sky than anywhere else in the world. A kingdom called Veloria. And at the very heart of Veloria, perched high on a rocky cliff that looked over everything, stood a castle.
Grand.
Ancient. Magnificent. And inside that castle on this particular night, there was only one person. A princess. Pause. Let the music swell slightly. She had a crown. She had power. She had a kingdom full of people who bowed their heads when she walked past. But tonight, as the rain poured down the castle walls and the thunder rolled across the mountains, Princess Elara sat alone by her window and whispered something to no one. Nobody came again today. Now here is the question I want you to hold in your mind as our story begins. What is the one thing a person can have everything in the world and still be missing? Stay with us. Because tonight, inside the walls of Veloria, Princess Elara is going to find the answer, and it is going to change her forever. And before we step inside those castle walls, if you love stories that stay with you long after they end, stories full of emotion, mystery, and truth, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell icon so you never miss a single episode. We tell stories worth remembering, and we don't want you to miss what comes next.
All right.
Let's go back to Veloria. To understand this night, this particular unforgettable night, you first need to understand the world Elara lived in. Veloria was not an ordinary kingdom. It sat nestled between three mountain ranges, each one taller and more dramatic than the last. The peaks were capped with snow year-round, and in the winter months, the whole valley below the castle would fill with a soft white mist that made it look as though the kingdom was floating in the clouds. The people of Veloria were proud people. They built with stone and sang with deep voices and kept their traditions the way other people keep their most precious belongings, carefully and close to the chest. And the castle that sat at the center of it all, the castle of Veloria, had stood for over 300 years. Its walls were thick gray stone, smooth in some places from centuries of hands brushing against them. Its towers rose high enough to catch the first light of dawn before it reached the valley. Its corridors were long and quiet and lined with painted portraits of every king and queen who had ever ruled. There were hundreds of rooms, grand halls with ceilings so high the chandeliers looked like distant stars, libraries with shelves that reached from floor to ceiling and smelled of old leather and candle wax, kitchens large enough to prepare feasts for 500 people, gardens enclosed within the inner walls, growing even in winter, filled with pale flowers that bloomed despite the cold. It was, by every measure, one of the most beautiful places in the known world. And Princess Elara had grown up inside every corner of it. She was 23 years old, tall, with dark eyes that noticed everything, and dark hair that she kept pinned back during the day and let fall loose at night when no one was watching. She wore her crown the way someone wears a piece of clothing they have forgotten is on their head, naturally, without thinking, because it had simply always been there. She was intelligent. She was composed. In the throne room, she spoke with the steady confidence of someone twice her age, and the advisors, old men who had served her parents before her, would sometimes catch each other's eyes across the long table and give a small, approving nod. She was, by all appearances, exactly what a princess should be. But appearances, as you may know, do not always tell the whole story. Elara's days followed a pattern that had not changed in over 2 years. She woke before the sun, dressed with the help of her attendants, and spent the first hours of the morning reviewing the matters of the kingdom, letters from the lords of the outer provinces, trade reports, requests for royal decisions on matters large and small. By midday, she had usually held at least one formal meeting with her council. By afternoon, she walked the castle, not aimlessly, but with purpose, checking in with the staff, inspecting preparations for whatever event was coming next. And then the evening came. And, with the evening came the quiet. The attendants retired. The council left for their own quarters or their own homes in the town below. The corridors, so full of movement during the day, went still. And Elara would find herself sitting in her favorite chair, by the tall window in her private chamber, looking out over the dark valley below, with nothing to fill the silence but the sound of the wind against the glass. It had been like this since her parents died. Her mother had passed first, 3 winters ago now, taken by a fever that moved fast and gave little warning. Her father had followed less than a year later. Some said it was the same illness. Others said it was grief. Elara suspected it was both. She had not been given time to mourn properly. There was too much to manage. The kingdom needed a steady hand at the throne, and she was the only one left to provide it. So she had straightened her back. She had put on the crown. She had done what needed to be done. And somewhere in the process of doing all of that, somewhere between the first council meeting and the 100th formal letter, she had simply gotten used to being alone. The night our story takes place was not special in any way that could have been predicted. It was deep winter, the kind of cold that settles into stone buildings and does not leave. Outside, a storm had been building all day, clouds gathering over the eastern peaks, turning the sky a heavy, bruised gray by mid-afternoon. By nightfall, the rain had come, then the thunder, then the kind of wind that made even the thickest walls feel a little thin. The staff had been dismissed early. There was nothing requiring their presence, and the storm made travel back to the town below dangerous if they waited too long. Elara had waved them off herself, telling them she would be fine, that there was nothing she needed. She meant it when she said it. By 9 o'clock, the castle was completely silent except for the storm. Elara sat in her chair by the window, as she always did. She had a book open in her lap, but she had not turned a page in over an hour. She was looking at the rain running down the glass in long, crooked lines, each drop joining the next, sliding down and disappearing at the bottom of the frame. It was a perfectly ordinary night, and yet something about it felt different. Perhaps it was the storm. Perhaps it was the particular quality of the silence, deeper than usual, more complete. Perhaps it was simply that she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Whatever it was, she felt it pressing against her chest that night in a way she usually managed to ignore. She closed the book, set it on the small table beside her, stood up and walked to the window, pressing one hand flat against the cold glass. "Nobody came today," she said, quietly to the rain. It wasn't entirely true, of course. People had come. The head steward had brought her the morning reports. 2 advisors had attended the afternoon meeting. A kitchen attendant had delivered her evening meal. But none of them had come for her. They had come for the princess. For the crown. For the position. Not one of them had sat across from her and simply asked, "How are you doing, Elara?" Not the kingdom. Not the crown. You. She turned away from the window and walked, without any particular plan, into the corridor outside her chamber. The hallway was dark except for the wall lanterns, burning low at this hour. Her footsteps echoed on the stone floor. She passed the portraits of her ancestors, their painted eyes following her, or seeming to, as they always had, and walked past the door to the council chamber, past the old music room, past the narrow staircase that led up to the east tower. She was not sure where she was going until she found herself standing outside a door she had not opened in a very long time. Her mother's study. It was on the 2nd floor, tucked at the end of a short corridor that branched off the main hallway, easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. The door was plain wood, no carving, no decoration. Her mother had always said that the most important rooms didn't need to advertise themselves. Elara stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she reached out and turned the handle. The room smelled of her mother. That was the first thing. The particular combination of dried flowers and old books and something warmer underneath that Elara had never been able to name but had always associated with safety. She stood in the doorway and breathed in. The room was as it had been left. A writing desk, a small bookcase, an armchair near the cold fireplace, a narrow window that looked out over the inner garden. On the desk, a quill pen sitting in an inkwell, a few papers, neatly stacked. And in the corner, on the lowest shelf of the bookcase, almost hidden behind a row of larger volumes. A small box, wooden, carved with a simple pattern of leaves around the edges. A latch, not a lock. Elara crossed the room and picked it up. She brought it back to the armchair, sat down and opened it. Inside, resting on a folded piece of cloth, was a book. Small, leather-bound, worn at the corners in the way things get worn when they have been handled often and with care. A diary. Her mother's handwriting on the inside cover, for my own eyes. And perhaps one day for hers. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She turned to the first page and began to read. And she did not stop for a very long time. The diary began when her mother, Queen Mira, was 19 years old, for years before she married Elara's father, before she became a queen, before any of it. The writing was different then. Looser, less careful. The ink sometimes ran or blotted where the pen had pressed too hard in moments of feeling. Elara read about a young woman who loved the mountains and hated formal dinners, who had a best friend named Leor who used to sneak her out of the palace through a servant's entrance so they could walk through the market in the town below without anyone recognizing her, who once climbed onto the roof of the East Tower on a dare and sat there watching the stars for 3 hours because she couldn't figure out how to get back down. She read about a person she had never known existed. Not the queen, not the mother, the girl. And then, as the diary moved forward in years, she read something that stopped her completely. An entry written in her mother's later handwriting, older, more controlled, but still recognizable. I have been queen for 6 years now, and I think I am only just beginning to understand what that means. It does not mean power, not really. It means responsibility. It means that every room you walk into, people stop being themselves and start performing. It means that the person you were before the crown, the girl who laughed too loudly and tripped on the stairs and cried at the wrong times, has to live somewhere very quiet, very deep inside, where no one can see her. I am lonely. I do not say that to anyone. How could I? I have a kingdom. I have a husband who is good and fair and tries to understand me. I have staff who anticipate my every need. But I am lonely in the way that I think only people like me are lonely, surrounded by everyone and known by no one. I keep Leor's letters in the box. I have never told anyone about Leor. I think I am afraid that if I speak about the things that made me myself before all of this, the things that belong only to me, they will somehow become less real, less mine. Elara set the diary down in her lap. The storm outside was still loud, but she barely heard it now. Her mother had been lonely. Her strong, composed, steady mother. The woman who had seemed to Elara like the most capable person in any room she entered, had sat in this same castle and felt exactly what Elara felt every single evening by that window. She looked down at the diary again. She kept reading. Near the back of the diary, the entries were more spaced out now, less frequent, as if her mother had found less time or less need for them. She found a page that had clearly been written in a rush. The handwriting was hurried, and the entry was short. Something I want to remember. The loneliness is not the enemy. I have decided. The loneliness is just a door. The question is whether you let it keep you shut inside, or whether you find what it is that the door is asking you to open. And then, on the very last written page of the diary, to my daughter, if you ever find this, and I think you might because you have always been the one who looks in corners, I want you to know something your mother never quite managed to say out loud. You are not alone. You have never been alone. I am here, in every stone of this place, in every room you walk through, in every decision you make that I taught you how to make. The loneliness you feel is real. Do not let anyone tell you it isn't. But it is not the whole truth. The whole truth is that love does not leave just because the person does. Elara read that last page 3 times. Then she closed the diary, held it to her chest, and let herself cry, fully, completely, without trying to stop, for the first time and longer than she could remember. When the tears had passed, Elara sat quietly for a long while. The storm was beginning to ease outside. She could still hear the rain, but the thunder had moved on, rolling away into the distance over the eastern mountains. She looked around her mother's study with new eyes. How many times had she walked past this door in the last 2 years and not come in? How many times had she told herself she wasn't ready? Or, worse, how many times had she simply not thought of it at all, too caught up in the business of managing a kingdom to pause and be a daughter? She stood up slowly and began to look around the room, properly this time, not the quick glance she'd given it when she first entered. On the desk, beneath the neatly stacked papers, she found a folded letter that had never been sent. The name on the outside simply said Lior. She did not open it. That belonged to her mother, but she held it for a moment and thought about what it meant to have words inside you that you never found a way to say. On the small bookcase, behind the larger volumes, she found 3 more items tucked away: a dried flower pressed between 2 pieces of paper, a small painted portrait no bigger than her hand, and a ring. The ring was simple, silver, with a single small stone the color of the winter sky. Not the kind of thing a queen would wear to a formal event. The kind of thing someone wore because it meant something. Elara picked it up carefully. On the inside of the band, barely visible, were 2 letters engraved, M and L. Mira. And Lior. She turned it in her fingers. It caught the low lamplight and threw a small constellation of reflections onto the ceiling above her. This was who her mother had been before the crown. This small, quiet ring was proof of it. Elara closed her fingers around it. She looked up at the portrait. It was of a young woman she didn't recognize, dark-eyed, laughing, caught in a moment of complete unself-consciousness. Written on the back, in her mother's hand, L. At the river, summer. The best afternoon. Elara looked at the face in the portrait for a long time. Then she moved to the last part of the room she had not yet explored, a narrow door half hidden behind the armchair. She had assumed it was a storage closet, but when she pulled the armchair aside and opened the door, she found something else entirely. A small room. More of an alcove, really. Barely large enough for the single cushioned bench that sat inside it, and the narrow window above it that looked out over a part of the inner garden Elara had never been able to see from anywhere else in the castle. This had been her mother's private place. Her real private place, not the study, which was still technically part of the official castle, but this tucked-away corner, invisible to everyone, where a queen could simply be a person for a few minutes. On the bench was one more item. A small envelope, sealed with plain wax, with a single word on the front. Elara. Her hands were not quite steady as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It was short, just a few lines, written carefully, as if her mother had thought about every word before putting it down. My darling girl, if you have found your way here, to this little room that no one else knows about, then I think you were ready to find it. I used to sit here when the castle felt too large and the crown felt too heavy, and I needed to remember that I was still me underneath all of it. I hope you will sit here too sometimes. I hope it gives you what it gave me. And I hope you will remember on the nights when it all feels like too much. You were loved before you were a princess. You were wanted before you were needed. And that love, the kind that lives in small rooms and old rings and undelivered letters, that love does not go anywhere. It is the most permanent thing I own. And I am leaving it all to you. Elara sat down on the bench. She looked out the small window at the inner garden below, just visible in the darkness, the pale winter flowers glowing faintly in the last of the storm's light. For a long time, she simply sat. By the time Elara left the alcove, the rain had stopped. She could tell by the quality of the silence. The castle quiet was different now, not the oppressive, pressing silence of the early evening, but something cleaner, something that had been washed through. She walked back through her mother's study, carefully replacing everything as she had found it. She kept the ring. She kept the diary. Everything else she left. It felt right to leave it there, undisturbed, for the room to keep. She walked back through the dark corridors, past the portraits of her ancestors, back toward her own chamber. But instead of going inside, she went to the window at the end of the hall, the wide one that looked out over the valley and the mountains beyond. The storm had cleared the sky completely. There were more stars than she had seen in months, brilliant and dense across the dark expanse above the peaks. And the moon. She had not noticed the moon all evening. The moon was out, full and bright, turning the snow-covered mountains below it into something that looked almost luminous. She stood at the window for a long time. She thought about her mother, sitting in that little room, alone and not alone, burdened and still somehow herself underneath it all. She thought about the ring, now warm in her hand from being held. She thought about the words, "You were loved before you were a princess." Something was loosening in her chest. Not breaking. That wasn't quite the right word. More like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long was finally beginning to ease. She had spent 2 years running from the quiet, filling every hour with the work of being a princess, because if she stopped moving long enough, the loneliness caught up with her, and she didn't know what to do with it when it did. But her mother had known. Her mother had found a way, not to make the loneliness disappear, but to sit with it, to look at it honestly, to find the door inside it. Elara looked down at the ring again. She slid it onto her finger. It fit, almost exactly. She made a decision, not the kind you announce, but the quiet kind, the kind that happens inside before it ever shows on the outside. Tomorrow, she would do something different.
She didn't know exactly what yet.
But she knew it had something to do with the people around her. The ones who served her, who managed her mornings and prepared her meals and kept the castle running. She had never asked them how they were. Not really. Not in the way one person asks another person. She would start there. She pressed one hand flat against the cold glass of the window, the same gesture she had made hours earlier, in despair. But it felt different now. She took a breath. Then she walked back to her chamber, set the diary carefully on her bedside table, lay down, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without dreaming. Dawn came slowly over the mountains of Veloria. The light came first as a pale gray line along the eastern ridge, then deepened to rose, then to amber, then finally to a full and generous gold that poured down over the snow-covered peaks and into the valley below. Elara was already awake when it came. She had been sitting by her window, the diary in her lap, the ring on her finger, watching the sky change color. She had not read the diary again. She had just held it, the way you hold something that has become important. When the light reached the castle windows, she stood up. She dressed quickly, without waiting for her attendants. She put on something simple, not a formal gown, just a warm dress, dark wool, practical. She kept the ring on. She opened her chamber door and stepped into the corridor. The first person she encountered was Sarah, a young woman who had worked in the castle kitchens for 4 years and who brought Elara her morning tea every day without fail. Sarah was coming around the corner with the tray, moving carefully the way she always did, eyes down, focused on not spilling. She looked up when she heard footsteps and immediately straightened, the slight, automatic stiffening that happened whenever someone encountered the princess unexpectedly. "Your Highness, good morning. Your tea." "Sarah," Elara said. The girl stopped. Something in the princess's voice, different from usual, somehow less formal, made her look up fully. "How are you?" Elara asked. Not, "Are things running smoothly in the kitchen?" that kind of question. I mean, how are you? Are you well? Is your family well? Sarah stared at her for a moment, completely unprepared for the question. Then something shifted in the girl's face, a small softening, a surprise that was not unpleasant. "Ah, yes, Your Highness. I am well, thank you. My mother has been ill, but she is recovering." "I'm glad to hear it," Elara said. And she meant it, not as a pleasantry but as a real, human statement. "I hope she recovers fully. And I'm sorry you've been carrying that worry." Sarah blinked. There were tears in her eyes, suddenly, and she looked faintly embarrassed by them. "Thank you," she said quietly. Thank you." They stood in the corridor together for a moment, a princess and a kitchen girl, both surprised by the small, warm space that had just opened between them. Then Elara nodded, took the tea from the tray, and continued down the corridor. She encountered 3 more people before she reached the Great Hall. Each time she stopped. Each time she asked something real. Each time she got a real answer. By the time she reached the Great Hall, she could feel something different moving through the castle, not a dramatic transformation, nothing that would be visible in any report or noted in any record. Just a subtle warming, a slight loosening of the air. In the Great Hall, she stopped in front of the portrait of her mother. Queen Mira looked back at her from the painting, composed, regal, the crown placed perfectly. But now Elara saw something in the painted face she had not noticed before. Something in the set of the eyes that was not formal at all. Something that looked, if you looked closely enough, like someone who was quietly hoping to be known. Elara reached up and put her hand on the ring her mother had worn. "I found the room," she said, quietly, to the portrait. "I read everything." She paused. "I'll take better care of what you left me." She let her hand drop. Then she turned and walked toward the morning, the long windows of the great hall filling with that generous gold light, warm against her face, warm against the ring on her finger, warm in the way that certain ordinary mornings are unexpectedly, undeservedly, beautifully warm. There is a thing about loneliness that nobody tells you. It is not the enemy. It is not a sign that something is wrong with you, or that you are broken, or that you have somehow failed to do what everyone else manages to do without difficulty. It is not a punishment. It is not a permanent condition. It is not a verdict. Loneliness is a door. That is what Queen Mira understood, sitting alone in her little room behind the armchair in the study, watching the winter garden below. That is what she tried to say in the words she wrote on that last page of her diary, the words she left for a daughter she hoped would someday be ready to read them. Loneliness is a door, and what it is asking you to do is open it. Not to pretend it isn't there, not to fill every quiet moment with noise so you don't have to hear it, but to sit with it, honestly, and ask it what it wants. And what it wants almost always under everything is connection. Real connection. The kind where one person looks at another person and actually sees them. Not the title, not the role, the person. Princess Elara learned this in a single stormy night in the castle of Veloria. She learned it from a small wooden box, from a leather-bound diary, from a ring with 2 letters engraved on the inside, from a tiny hidden room that smelled of her mother's presence, from a letter addressed simply to her name. She did not become a different princess after that night. She was still the same person, still composed, still capable, still steady in the throne room and thoughtful at the council table. But she was also, from that morning forward, someone who stopped in corridors and asked people how they were. Someone who sometimes sat in a little alcove and looked at a winter garden and simply let herself be quiet without feeling afraid of it. Someone who wore a simple silver ring that had nothing to do with royalty and everything to do with love. And the castle of Veloria, that grand, gray, ancient place, it breathed a little differently after that. The walls were the same. The corridors were the same. The chandeliers still hung like distant stars from the great hall ceiling. But there was something warmer moving through it now. And it started with one person on one stormy night, opening a door she had walked past too many times. The loneliness had asked her something. And finally, she had answered. And that, my friends, is the story of Princess Elara's lonely night in the castle of Veloria. Now I want to hear from you in the comments right now. Tell me, where are you watching from? Which state in the USA are you watching from? Are you in California? Texas? New York? Florida? Maybe somewhere like Montana or Oregon or Tennessee. Drop your state down in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know where in the world you are as you listen to these stories. We'll see you in the next one.